For a long time, James lived like a ghost, drifting through places that were never meant to be home. His footsteps echoed in unfamiliar streets, the cold wind biting against his skin, but nothing stung as sharply as the memory of Yip's smile. Soft, warm, and painfully distant. He had left to protect her, or at least that was what he kept telling himself during those endless nights. But truthfully, he had been running from betrayal, from fear, from the shattered pieces of his own past. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, when the world quieted enough for him to hear his own heartbeat, he wondered whether Yip still thought of him, whether she still waited at the little wooden gate of her small house, listening to the sound of engines passing by, hoping one of them would be him. But time had a cruel way of stretching when loneliness settled in, and James feared that maybe, just maybe, she had stopped hoping. Meanwhile, far away in the dusty little village, Yip carried her days like someone used to pain. Every morning she packed fruit into 2 old baskets, walked to the market, and smiled politely at customers. The children adored her, but even they sensed something missing. Her laugh was softer, shorter. Her eyes wandered whenever someone mentioned the name James. She lived, but her heart was suspended, caught between waiting and letting go. Sometimes at the market, she would pause suddenly, as if she felt James walking somewhere in the crowd. But when she turned, all she saw were strangers hurrying through their own complicated lives. She would breathe out slowly and remind herself, "He left for a reason. You must be strong." And so she kept moving, though her steps were heavier each day. James sensed the distance too. He felt it like a thread stretching thinner, trembling as though it might snap at any moment. The guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. He knew he had disappeared without giving Yip the truth about the danger, about the betrayals, about the people hunting him. But he told himself it was better she didn't know. Better she stayed safe. Still, every path he walked eventually led him back to one truth. He could run from the world, but not from the longing that whispered Yip's name in every breath. And somewhere deep inside, a decision quietly stirred, one that would soon pull him back to the place he once called home.
Days after their unexpected reunion, James found himself replaying Diep's voice in his mind, soft, steady, and strangely grounding. It was ridiculous, he told himself, an accomplished CEO, feared in boardrooms and revered in the industry, undone by a girl who sold vegetables at the morning market. Yet every time he tried to bury the feeling, it rose again, stronger and more insistent, like a forgotten melody returning with aching clarity. Life didn't slow down for James. The company was in turmoil, whispers of betrayal, papers full of accusations, investors shaking their heads as if they had never once praised him. Even the walls of his office seemed to close in. But amidst the chaos, there was one moment of stillness he kept returning to. Diep, standing under the shade of a mango tree, sunlight catching the loose strands of her hair, asking him simply, "Are you okay, James?" Nobody had asked him that in years. One evening, weighed down by rumors and exhaustion, he drove aimlessly until the city lights faded behind him. His heart led him down the winding rural road to Diep's small home. He knew it was impulsive, dangerously so, but something in him refused to turn back. She was outside, watering the small garden she tended with more care than he had ever given anything in his own life. When she looked up, confusion flickered across her face, followed by a warmth that loosened something inside him. "James, why are you here?" He opened his mouth to answer, but the truth felt too heavy to speak. How could he tell her he just wanted to breathe somewhere that didn't hurt? Instead, he simply said, "I needed to see you." Diep laughed softly, not mocking, just surprised, and invited him inside. She brewed him ginger tea, the kind his mother used to make when he was young. The scent filled the room, stirring memories he had long buried. Innocence, safety, a life before ambition swallowed everything. For the first time in months, James allowed himself to sit still, to listen, to exist without performing. Diep talked about her day, worries about crop prices, the stray cat she had adopted, her aunt who scolded her for working too much. Ordinary things, simple things, but each word eased the pressure around his heart. Somewhere between her laughter and the rustling of the banana leaves outside, a thought settled quietly inside him. He didn't want this peace to be temporary. Not this time. Not with her.
There are moments in life when the world seems to slow, as if urging you to pay attention. For James, that moment arrived one late afternoon when the sky glowed amber and the air carried the scent of rain-soaked earth. He stood beside Diep at the edge of her small field, watching her tie bundles of freshly cut vegetables with a quiet focus that made everything else fade away. It was strange, he thought, how a woman who had so little could make him feel as though he finally had enough. But life, as always, had its way of reminding him that peace never came without a price. His phone buzzed relentlessly, dozens of missed calls, urgent messages, reports of investors pulling out, scandals resurfacing, and an anonymous source leaking confidential documents. The company he had poured his youth into was collapsing faster than he could catch it. He turned away from Diep, chest tightening, the weight of responsibility pressing against his lungs. She noticed, immediately. "James? Is something wrong?" He hesitated. How could he tell her everything? That enemies were circling him like vultures, that his own past mistakes were surfacing, that people he once trusted were now plotting his downfall. But then she stepped closer, her eyes full of a quiet strength he had never known he needed. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said softly. Those simple words cracked something open inside him. He told her, not everything, he wasn't ready for that, but enough for her to understand the storm brewing over him. When he finished, waiting for her reaction felt like waiting for rain to fall from a dark, swollen cloud. But Diep didn't step away. Instead, she gently took his trembling hands, hands that had built companies, negotiated empires, and battled boardrooms, and held them as though they deserved tenderness. "People fall," she whispered, "but that doesn't mean they're lost." Her voice was steady, the kind that could coax seeds into sprouting. Yet, even as comfort warmed him, a shadow lingered. Unseen by the two of them, a figure watched from the far side of the field, a man with tired eyes, unkempt clothes, and a guitar slung over his back. The homeless musician who had once crossed paths with Diep now seemed far too interested in James. And as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of danger, James felt a chill that whispered, peace was fleeting, and someone was watching. Night had a way of amplifying thoughts, stretching them, sharpening them, breathing life into fears that daylight usually softened. For James, that night felt heavier than all the nights before. The distant hum of crickets, the rustle of trees, even the faint glow from Diep's small wooden house, they all seemed to echo one question. Was he worthy of staying by her side? He walked slowly toward the front porch, where Diep sat, peeling sweet potatoes, her movements gentle, steady, unbothered by the world's chaos.
She looked up the moment she sensed him, as if her heart recognized his footsteps before her ears did. "James," she said softly, "you're trembling." He hadn't realized it. Perhaps it was dread, or perhaps it was the truth he had been running from finally catching up to him. He sat beside her, the old wooden step creaking under his weight. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence between them was not empty. It was loud, filled with the hum of everything he wished he could protect her from. "Diep." His voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. "There's something you need to know." She set the sweet potato aside, her full attention on him now, her eyes holding a mixture of warmth and worry. He took a deep breath, told her about the betrayal, about the financial traps closing in around him, about the musician who had been following them, watching them, and finally, about John, the man who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes, the one who wanted James ruined, the one whose revenge was tied to history neither of them realized they were a part of. When he finished, Diep sat frozen, her lips parted, her breath unsteady. A quiet tear slid down her cheek, not from fear, but from the weight of everything he had carried alone for so long. "James," she whispered, "why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I didn't want to lose you. I was afraid that once you knew everything, you'd walk away." Diep reached forward, cupping his face with trembling hands. "Leaving you has never been an option. But hiding the truth? That hurts more." Her honesty struck him harder than any blow from his enemies. Just then, a soft sound came from the darkness, the quiet crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. James reacted instantly, pulling Diep close as he turned toward the shadows. A figure stepped into the faint porch light, the homeless musician. His gaze locked, not on James, but on Diep. And in that chilling, breathless moment, James realized something. The storms he feared weren't coming. They were already here. In the quiet spaces between love and fear, we often discover who we truly are. James and Diep's journey teaches us that the strongest relationships are not those untouched by hardship, but those strengthened by it. Their story reminds us that love is not simply a feeling, it is a choice, repeated over and over, especially when circumstances become difficult. James spent years carrying burdens alone, believing that protecting Diep meant hiding the truth. But in doing so, he built a wall between them. His fear of losing her became a prison that kept him from reaching for the very support he needed. This is a lesson many of us learn too late. Love does not thrive in secrecy. It grows in honesty, even when honesty shakes us. Diep's reaction is equally powerful. She cried not because James was weak, but because he had been hurting in silence. Her tears were a reminder that people do not break when they face problems together. They break when they are shut out. Relationships flourish when both hearts are allowed to feel, to worry, to hope, and to heal. Their story also reflects an important truth about life. Storms will come, regardless of how carefully we plan our days. Enemies appear, difficulties rise, and uncertainty takes hold. But the measure of a person is not in how perfect their life is. It is in how they choose to stand during the moments of fear. James learned that vulnerability is not a weakness. It is the doorway to trust. Diep learned that loving someone means accepting their shadows as much as their light. Most importantly, their journey teaches us that support is not found in grand gestures, but in the quiet decision to stay. To stay when everything feels unstable. To stay when the future seems unclear. To stay because the connection you share is worth fighting for. In a world that constantly pushes us toward independence, their story reminds us of a gentle truth. Strength is not always standing alone. Sometimes true strength is allowing someone to take your hand, look into your fears, and say, "You don't have to face this by yourself." And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. That love, when chosen with courage, becomes the one place where even the most wounded heart can finally rest.